Hello and welcome to Impact the Borough, a podcast from the Greensboro Chamber of Commerce. I'm Brent Christensen, the President and CEO of the Chamber. Each week we'll highlight what we're doing to start and grow businesses, create quality jobs, and develop our workforce. We'll also check in with our community partners to share inspiring stories and important information from across our community. This podcast is brought to you by Truliant Federal Credit Union, a modern, mission-driven financial institution focused on the needs of its members, the businesses it serves, and our community. With 5 locations in Guilford County, including a dedicated commercial lending office at Friendly Center and a highly rated mobile banking app, Truliant makes it their business to help you grow yours. Visit Truliant.org for more information.
Hello, everyone. This is Niketa Greene, Vice President of Leadership, Diversity, and Inclusion for the Greensboro Chamber of Commerce. A little over a year ago, shortly after the murder of George Floyd, hundreds of Greensboro residents signed the Greensboro Against Racism Pledge. And we committed to becoming agents of change and holding ourselves and our fellow community members accountable. I'll actually take a moment and just read a brief part of that pledge. And it reads, "We cannot stand by silently while across our country and right here at home, people continue to be targeted and endangered based on their skin color. We've come together, business leaders, community leaders, and clergy of all faiths, to join our voices in protest against the inherent inequalities in our country's institutions and policies." This pledge included commitments to forge friendships and relationships and partnerships, to create real bonds of community, to work together to be agents of change, to recognize our personal biases, and a number of other things. So today, I'm here with a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert, Jada Monica Drew, to talk about how people across Greensboro and across the country have lived out that pledge and pledges that are similar to that, and the work that still needs to be done to make our community an equitable place for people of color. So Jada, thank you for joining us, and I'd love for you to introduce yourself and tell us about you and Social Designs.
Hi, Niketa. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited about the conversation today. So Social Designs is a leadership and diversity firm. We serve as a catalyst for individual and organizational growth. And that growth is customized through client-centered consulting, strategic planning, training, facilitation, coaching, and also online courses.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm familiar with your work, so I know that you do a lot in this space. Before we get into just finding out some insights from you, I just wanted to share that here in Greensboro, we've actually, at the Chamber and the City of Greensboro, have done a number of things in the past year to kind of start to working on that pledge. And so, for example, the City of Greensboro has a something called the Race Initiative. Mm-hmm. And that stands for Reflecting on and Considering Experiences. That initiative included a number of policy changes that came about as a result of the initiative. And at the Chamber of Commerce, we've done a number of things, including implementing a new program called Other Voices, executive program, to give an opportunity for some chief leaders and organizations to really dive into discussion and dialogue around diversity and inclusion and the isms in our community. We've implemented a new program to address some disparity among minority businesses. We facilitated a 3-day discussion called One City, One Film, where we joined together and watched a film together that dealt with race and disparity. So there's a number of things just between our two organizations that we've done to kind of address those things. So the conversation about anti-racism was at a groundswell, and DEI professionals became incredibly busy. So did you begin to get contacted immediately following the death of George Floyd? Have you seen an uptick in the demand for your services as a DEI trainer in the last year?
You know, it's amazing that it's been a year since the murder of George Floyd, and just reflecting now, as an individual during that moment, I feel like I was at a standstill. Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. We're seeing this. I remember seeing it on my social media feed. I had to take a break because it was just horrendous to watch over and over and over again. And I think the world was at a standstill also. Wow, this is happening. We're seeing it on film. We're trying to figure out as a community here locally, as well as nationally and internationally, like what to do. I think that many organizations were in the moment of, or in the, not necessarily the moment, I'll say in the process of developing, whether it's a DEI strategy or opportunities to connect specifically with, let's say, their Black communities through philanthropy, or connect with Black communities through understanding business, similar to the chamber. And so to me, the uptick, it didn't come immediately, because people were sitting in, what do we do? And it was during a pandemic. So a lot of people were not working. People were anxious in general, just about the health of the world. So I think there were lots and lots of components that made people just kind of sit still. And then there was an uprising, many, many, many uprisings. People were sharing via art. I remember walking through Greensboro about a month or two after, and just seeing the murals that were all over the city of people expressing their hurt, but also expressing the need to come together. And watching some of the things that you've mentioned, come about, whether it's the One City, One Voice, whether it's the pledge, and seeing so many different people just wanting to learn more and help. And so over about, I would say about the course of a couple of months, people were in the mode once again of figuring it out. And so after a couple of months, I began to definitely receive lots of inquiries. People were, after they released statements, we, don't agree with what happened with George Floyd, and we want to do something. And the do something, it just expanded from, we just want to talk, we want to give people the opportunity to talk and express themselves, to we want to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion in our strategy, to we want to, develop caucuses where people sit down and talk with their affinity groups and then come together. So it was a range of things. And I think, a reason why I answered that question so long-winded is because it was so much going on that I think as humans, we have to take the time to say, wow, we were experiencing a lot. And with the companies that reached out, like I mentioned, there were some companies who had been working in diversity, equity, and inclusion. There were some who started, but there was a standstill. And there were other organizations who had no clue. Many people didn't know what to do. But the catalyst, which is something that I always wanted to keep center and still keep center to today, is the catalyst of all of that movement, all of the what people are calling the racial reckoning, was because a Black man was murdered, and we'd seen it multiple times. And so then there became I think a need to support the Black community. And now we are still doing that. Also, people wanting to engage in more diversity, equity, and inclusion. So my short answer to your question is yes. But there was I think a process leading up to it. And still, people are wanting to engage in the conversation because of that moment last year.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you gave the long-winded version first, because when we reflect on it, it was an incredibly painful thing to experience, to watch, to be a part of, and to do that while in a pandemic was deeply, deeply impactful. You mentioned that there were a number of different things that companies wanted to do, and it sounds like there was a progression, that they were started with conversations and led into other things. What kinds of things that you engage in? Was that training? Was it coaching? What kinds of things did you do? And what have you seen are the biggest issues that employers were grappling with related to inclusion, equity, diversity, belonging?
People were asking for all of the above, from training, consulting, coaching. Some people wanted to, just take courses to learn. Some people reached out like, hey, what books can we read? We just want to do something. So most people just wanted to do something. And to be candid, a lot of leaders had no clue. They didn't know what to do. There were some leaders who said, we've been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have training. We have someone in that position, but this is different, and we have no clue what to do. People are expressing their hurt socially. They're also expressing hurt with our organization, and a lot of people were hearing a lot of these things for the first time. And luckily, our process with Social Designs, it was already, I think, the way that we do our work, because it's so custom and because there's a lot of discovery and a lot of evaluation before we work with clients, it was a really good opportunity for us to share that methodology with our clients and potential clients by first saying, what is the problem? Tell us more about your organization. Tell us more about the management structure. Tell us more about the culture. We ask tons of questions before we start to engage with people so that we clearly understand what it is that they want to do. Because there's a difference between wanting to create an inclusive environment because the current environment is toxic versus we want to have more people who are African American within our organization. And so I think people were just trying to figure out, where do we fall within this spectrum? And so, like I mentioned, part of our process, it starts with a discovery and really aligning people on what they mean when they say we want DEI. I always start with, diversity is not a code word for everything that's not white, not US citizen, not heterosexual, not all the things that you would, in air quotes, say are the majority. And so first making sure that people are aligned in what we mean when we say diversity is so important in the conversation. I truly believe, and just having been in the field almost 20 years, diversity is so much more than just everything that's not white. And we lean into the conversation, letting people know that first you have to understand that these terms and what they mean for your organization, and take the time to educate, re-educate, and redefine, if necessary, for your organization what it means in action. And the process for moving forward for every organization is always different. You have to have the capacity if you want to move into training. You have to be open to feedback if you want to have a consultant to come and basically open the door into the closets of your organizations to start asking you these questions about culture. And capacity is a huge thing. Also understanding how people manage in general is huge in our work. And I've learned that most times is that people haven't been trained to manage. And when you're not trained to manage, whether it's middle or upper management, there's a huge a huge floodgate, if you will, that opens up that allows for more unpleasant and unhealthy bias to creep in, because we all have it. And so you have to make sure that you're looking at every single component of the organization before you jump in and just say, oh, we want to do DEI. So let's just slow down and figure out, why do you need it? And what do you even understand it to be? And most times the understanding across the organization is very, very different. So that alignment is so important.
I love that approach. Because I do think we were all grappling, we were all struggling to do something. And I think that's so important that, that you take a pause and say, let's think about this. So let's be thoughtful about what we're doing. So I love that. I know that you work a lot with chief executives and key leaders in organizations, but I imagine you've heard from employees as well. What sentiments have you heard from the employees themselves as you were going through this process with organizations?
Some of the sentiments that we hear are, our organization talks the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And like I said, I ask a lot of questions. I always say, well, what does that mean? What kind of talk are they talking that doesn't match the walk that they are not walking? And helping employees to actually articulate what that means. Because like I said, alignment is so important. So sometimes there's a toxic culture and people are not able to express what they want in the workplace, or there is a there is a lack of a certain area of diversity, whether it's in let's say middle management, for example, may have tons of women. And then upper management, you may see more men, and it just depends on the field. So we work with organizations from federal agencies to schools to municipalities to architect organizations to mining organizations. So it just varies, but every organization, I think, at the very employees specifically, the first thing I've seen is that people don't feel heard, and they haven't been given the skills to communicate with one another. And their managers don't have the skills to listen. And a lot of times people don't listen to their managers because there's a perceived, whether it's a perceived power dynamic, or people don't understand how the organization operates. So there's a communication gap there. And usually when we teach people first how to have dialogue, all of those things that I just mentioned, plus possible opportunities to explore bias or discrimination, depending on areas of diversity, those things come out because people now have the tools to really articulate why an organization isn't walking the walk and they're just talking the talk. And we do that through key dialogue principles. So we teach people how to have dialogue, work them through the process. A lot of times it's very, very awkward to teach adults how to communicate, and they feel awkward. Like we actually literally ask them, count how many times you're doing this principle, count how many times you're being curious, count how many times you're acknowledging your bias. And it feels extremely uncomfortable in the beginning, but the more you practice, I think it gives people the courage, and it empowers employees to talk to their managers and vice versa. We also break down what I think a lot of people say are microaggressions. So microaggressions are things that are explained in the field as, things that people say that are inappropriate, but they're not, let's say, so inappropriate that you will go to HR. So it's more of, I would call them just cultural misunderstandings. That's what I call microaggressions. And often people don't even talk about them. So one of the most known microaggression, and maybe you've heard of this one, people say that, you're not supposed to ask people about their hair, Black women about their hair, or touch their hair. I personally have never had anybody trying to touch my hair. They may ask questions about my hair, and I'm fine to have conversations because hair is hair. However, having the dialogue principles to talk about those things, or cultural cues, like for example, your hair right now, Niketa, for example, looks like you have a twist out. I don't know. Or maybe you have flat hair. So I'm giving the audience a little bit of cultural cues about Black hair.
Right.
I call my hair right now is a slick back. Just put a little gel on it before I might blow it out. And so to me, leaning into those cultural conversations are so much helpful than saying, oh, we shouldn't have these conversations at all, because people are thinking it. So let's give them the tools to talk about it, or give them the tools to say, I would rather not talk about it because it's personal. So those are some of the things that I find are extremely helpful. And we have a tool that I never thought would be so impactful in helping people just talk about culture. Because so many times when we're talking about race and racism or sexism, all these isms get in the way of us truly seeing who we are as humans, and truly allowing us to give each other grace when we're talking about difference. And when we ask people to share about their traditions, their culture, their words and phrases, their how they experience music and dance and conflict and competition, and how do they feel about wealth, when working with philanthropic organizations, then they lean into things that then move into talking about the culture of the organization. So it's like taking very, very baby steps that you would think we would do as humans, but I think we've been socialized so much not to talk about difference. At the same time, we've been socialized to celebrate difference. So I have I would say a knack, and I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to stepping into that nuance and helping people like see themselves as whole people, and then sharing that with one another and simply asking questions and leaning into being brave and critical. The whole concept of safe space to me is a bit overdone. We're safe. We know how to, make sure that our bodies are taken care of. We can go use the bathroom. We can walk out of a room if we need to for safety. But we really need to lean into being brave and asking critical questions and being open to questions from other people and being emotionally intelligent. So when something is happening within the workplace, let's articulate it, but let's articulate it in a way that moves toward action. And so I think offering up the leaders, just that word grace has been very, very helpful in our work. Like, lean into discomfort, give yourself and give your employees grace and room for people to make mistakes. That was another long-winded answer, but I hope it was helpful.
No, it's a lot of nuggets in there, especially about grace, because that's necessary when you're having conversations that are different and unique. So I appreciate that. I want to talk about the impact of everything that has transpired, in particular anti-racism conversations and trainings and coachings. So on the NPR podcast Code Switch, they featured recently, they talked about the racial reckoning, and they featured researchers who found that actually sentiment towards Black Lives Matter and toward disparity among Black people had actually decreased or even lower post-pandemic, so in January of this year, than they were before the death of George Floyd. Additionally, the creative investment research found that corporate pledges that were made last year to certain Black interest, to economic development and parity in the Black community in particular, that those pledges haven't quite been fulfilled yet. And so there is some thought, at least, that some of that impact hasn't been seen yet. And certainly it's been a short amount of time. But I would love to hear from you broadly as a community, as you have done this work. Are we making progress, and what positive changes have occurred in the past year?
So I think, are we making progress? That's one of the questions I've heard since I was probably like 7 years old in the United States. And to me, that question is similar to when people talk about DEI. It's so not only broad, but it doesn't get to a specific question or a specific problem that we're trying to solve. So I say that to say, if we look locally, let's just start in Greensboro. We ask the question, are we making progress? I then ask the question, are we making progress in the amount of Black businesses that we see? Are we making progress in the number of Black children that are graduating from high school? Are we making progress in the number of Black entrepreneurs? Are we making progress in the infrastructure in Black communities? So if we break down, I think as communities, when we ask questions like that, we need to be more specific. And if you notice, I didn't say Black graduation compared to a group, because I think the progress question, once again, is so convoluted and we have to be very specific. So to answer your question, I'll say we'll need to first identify what progress are we talking about. Are people getting along better? I don't know. It just depends on what organization you're talking about. If I use the chamber as an example, I was able to participate in the inner city visit with tons of leaders in the city and outside of the city, and I learned so much about East Greensboro now, and Invest Greensboro, and the majority of people who live in East Greensboro are Black, and so from that perspective, I've seen just in those presentations a lot of progress from an economic perspective, and how much the city of Greensboro, for example, is investing East, and how much entrepreneurs, Black and other, are investing East. And so I think, yes, there is some progress in the organizations that I work with. I'm seeing people beginning to wrap inclusion and equity within the strategy of their organizations, not just for the now, but for the long term. I'm seeing organizations or leaders within organizations being more comfortable just in saying the word Black. Because once again, I believe in the United States, we've been socialized to say like people of color or African American, or people are just afraid to talk and to speak very candidly. So to me, that is progress, being able to have open conversations. There's one organization in particular that I'm working with, and they have, I think, made tons of progress just in making sure that they're baking in strategic targets for recruitment, specifically for Black staff members in the organization. But they're doing it in more of a partnership format versus we need to do this because there was a racial reckoning, but really taking the time to figure out why there has been a gap in recruitment of Black people within the organization, and then figuring out, well, what are we losing in that? What are we losing for our organization? And how can we create partnerships versus a transaction? And I would encourage organizations to think about how can you partner and bake diversity, equity, and inclusion, whichever those three words work for you, within the strategy of your organization, and then target the impact or target the progress so that we can collectively answer the question that you just asked.
Mm-hmm. What I've noticed as well is that I like what you said about baking inclusion into the strategy, because then that means that it reaches every aspect of the organization. I've noticed that companies have started to incorporate inclusion more intentionally in their talent retention and talent recruitment as well, which I think is so significant. But that's, I think, a part of what you're saying. So is there anything that you think employers need to focus more on as we move forward?
One of the biggest things I believe to focus on is really looking inwardly at your current staff and consistently asking them questions about what they can offer the organization, and not only looking like outside of the organization. Because there's some groups that I'm working with, they've had a DEI committee or a task force for, let's say, years, but the organization hadn't seen them as people who can contribute to the change within the organization. Not only is it cost effective, but it also helps with internal professional development. So there, definitely should be some coaching involved, some, support for them via professional development. But I think looking inwardly to ask your staff, like, what do you need and what's happening within the organization? Really listening inwardly, because there are people who have so much talent, and not just in creating more diversity, equity, and inclusion, but within their particular, area of expertise. I think tapping into affinity groups or employee resource groups are helpful, but doing it in a more innovative way, and not an antiquated way. So with employee resource groups, I think those are great ways for not only, your affinity groups via race or gender to come together by themselves, but I think they should merge and then talk about, as I mentioned, those cultural cues or, those cultural components, and then work with the organization to help change the organization. Another piece of advice I would say is, your HR department cannot do everything. HR professionals, if they're not trained in how to provide professional development, consult, and provide strategy support for a more inclusive and equitable environment, don't give them that title unless you're going to give them that training. And not only the training, but also compensation. So I see a lot of organizations where people have a dual role because they want to work inwardly, but then you're working people to the point where they can't do both jobs really well. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, I really, really firmly believe in the power of partnerships and relationships, and not just, moving toward saying you want to partner just for the current transaction, but to really build relationship with people in a more of a coalition fashion. So understanding what everyone's agenda is up front and having candid conversations in order to move the needle, and specifically, I would say the needle for the Black community in the United States, or maybe just focus on, locally, but constantly come to the conversation. So for example, with the inner city visit, since we talked about that earlier, there's a follow-up conversation, I think in a week or so, what now? But then there should be another follow-up conversation next quarter, because this conversation that we're having about East Greensboro or Invest East is something that I've heard ever since I've been in Greensboro. And so we're not consistently measuring the impact, or as you mentioned, the progress. We'll forget about it and we won't focus on it as much. So those are a few tidbits of what I think people can do to not just increase diversity, equity, and inclusion, but to be very, very intentional, and not be afraid to target populations that you see a gap in, and also to celebrate who's already within your organization. Diversity, once again, doesn't mean any and everything that's not white. Now, if that's what you're wanting to do, then just say that. But our firm truly believes that everyone can bring something to the table and move towards solutions for a more equitable and profitable and effective organization.
Great nuggets, Jada. I have one last question, and I know you kind of touched on this a bit, but how can individual employees contribute to making their workplaces more equitable?
I think one of the first things, and we teach this in our ABCs. So we have like ABCs of community building within our Sharpen Your Inclusion Edge course and texts. And the E is elevate. And I believe that every individual should create their own journey of discovery to educate and elevate themselves about diversity, equity, or inclusion, to make sure that they understand what it is that that they can do better within their work. So if you're a teacher, don't wait for your principal or your head of school to say, now we are introducing culturally responsive curriculum. Go ahead and do the research yourself. I mean, there's so many free resources. There's so many, audio books to lean into that conversation yourself, and to talk to people as you're, leaning into it, your colleagues. If you are, let's say, a middle manager and you're having trouble with a certain subset based on some cultural differences, then do your own research and then possibly change the way that you are having conversations with certain employees. Maybe you need to have more one-on-ones. Maybe those one-on-ones, maybe you're having them during a significant cultural or religious time frame. Like, let's talk about, for example, most performance reviews come all at once for organizations. And maybe you need to look at the cultural, religious, and spirituality calendar for the US, for example, and there are tons of calendars you can Google and see, well, maybe this particular employee, they're not leaning in every single year, but maybe they're fasting. So I think part of it is just really, digging into how you can learn more about people and research yourselves. One of the things that I've found very, very helpful is really kind of leaning into uncomfortable situations and talking to people that I know who are very different from me, but I may not have like a really close relationship with them, just to learn more about their culture and to learn more about some of the barriers that they may have in the workplace, just so I can understand, people better. So those are a few things that I can recommend. If another thing I would say organizationally, if you are experiencing discrimination, you believe discrimination or bias that's preventing you from being successful in the organization, definitely write down everything and talk to your supervisor or talk to whatever channels that are in place, because saying that you feel a certain way, or that something's not right when I talk to X person, that doesn't help the next person help you. So I used to coach individuals. I used to be a DEI coach for a couple of organizations, and some employees would say, Jada, I just don't feel like, my boss likes me, or I feel like this organization just treats X people different. And I would always ask them, well, what's your evidence? What's your, what has happened? And immediately, I think people get defensive when you ask for evidence. But if you have a child and you say, hey, and your child comes to you and your child is like, hey, I'm being treated differently in the classroom by my teacher, the first thing a parent is going to say, what happened? How did they treat you differently? What did they do? And my parents will say, well, what did you do first? So, and there's nothing wrong with that line of questioning. So in short, make sure you have evidence when you are, wanting to take a next step, if you feel like you're not being treated fairly in the organization, because that not only is helpful for you, but it's also helpful for, let's say, the people that you feel like aren't treating you fairly, because then they can see, oh, wow, this is what happened. Well, this was the intent, this was the impact, but now I see why you would feel this way, given what I said. This is not what I meant. Or it could be the reverse. It could be what they meant as a problem. But I think that's something that is very, very, very helpful for employees to do on their own.
Awesome. Jada, this has been it's been a short and powerful conversation. There is a ton for, I think, our listeners to learn and to take away. I'm sure there will be pen and paper out as people listen. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing so much of your wisdom with us. How can our audience learn more about you and your business?
You are welcome. It's been a pleasure. You can visit socialdesignsconsulting.com. We are open to conversations. If people just want to have a consultation and say, hey, this is what I'm going through and I don't know what to do. We also have tons of resources online on YouTube. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll see diversity and inclusion videos. There's also an upcoming Inclusion and Innovation Conference in October. The date to be announced soon. So you can visit bloominclusion.com to learn about that conference. And you can follow me on all social media platforms, Jada Monica Drew.
Excellent. Thank you again. That's it for us today. To learn more about the Chamber's commitment to anti-racism, visit greensboro.org/equity. Have a great day.
This podcast is brought to you by Truliant Federal Credit Union, a modern, mission-driven financial institution focused on the needs of its members, the businesses it serves, and our community. With 5 locations in Guilford County, including a dedicated commercial lending office at Friendly Center and a highly rated mobile banking app, Truliant makes it their business to help you grow yours. Visit truliant.org for more information. You can find all of our episodes on YouTube thanks to our video sponsor, North State. Make sure to subscribe so you'll get new episodes delivered to your device each week. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @GSO Chamber. See you next time.